Is NATO as militarily strong as it appears? Article 5 and getting 32 countries to agree on anything. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was established in April 1949 as an organization to defend Europe from the threat of the Soviet Union. NATO is considered the longest lasting, most successful defense alignment in its history in its 75 years of its existence. The measure of success is largely based on the fact that it did not have to fight a war, as its strength was a deterrent from Soviet and Warsaw Pact aggression. While this point may be debatable, NATO's Article 5 guarantees serve as the foundation for its deterrence through collective defense. Since the end of the Cold War and the subsequent expansion of NATO, it is important to investigate whether Article 5 alone, under NATO rules, truly serves as a deterrent. If it doesn't, then NATO's practical strength may be overestimated. Below is NATO's text for Article 5. Quote, "The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense, recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Any such armed attack and all measures taken as a result thereof shall immediately be reported to the Security Council. Such measures shall be terminated when the Security Council has taken the measures necessary to restore and maintain international peace and security." End quote. NATO states that Article 5 is the cornerstone of the treaty. When NATO was founded in 1949, it consisted of 12 countries. These countries, 10 of which were European, were recovering from World War II. Massive Soviet armies occupied the German zones of occupation, dividing Germany and its capital between the East and the West. In 1949, the U.S. nuclear monopoly came to an end when the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb in August 1949. The year prior, the Marshall Plan was started to help war-torn economies of the West recover as their post-war economies were sputtering and faltering, and especially in Central Europe, where it was feared to be susceptible to being exploited by communist incitement or outright revolution. The original founding members of NATO truly perceived an existential threat from the Soviet Union, and they would have unanimously responded to Soviet aggression, largely believing that their existence depended upon it. Article 5 undoubtedly served as the cornerstone and strength of the NATO alliance, enabling it to perceive and actually witness the dangers posed by the Soviet threat. However, the realities of 1948 and 49, the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, and the common threat belief of the 12 founding members in unitary steadfastness no longer hold true today, given that NATO has expanded to encompass 32 nations. Since then, Article 5 and the rules of NATO have remained unchanged, but the perceived threat, and more crucially, a unified response to such a perceived threat among the 32 nations, is highly doubtful. Most of NATO governments agree that Russia poses the greatest geographical threat to Europe. There are 32 nations that may view the Russian threat at different levels of alarm and may want to manage this threat within their national foreign policy objectives. The nations of the Indo-Pacific region view this issue as an aggressive China, the nations of Indo-Pacific region view the same issue with China, with an aggressive China. Different nations have different priorities and policies on how to manage a threat. NATO, when it was founded, was geographically aligned around the Atlantic and Western Europe. most having a common World War II and Soviet threat experience in post-World War II. Today, NATO extends into Southern and Eastern Europe and as far as Western Asia, and this includes all of Scandinavia in the north. Nearly all the European countries were members of the former Soviet bloc and of the Warsaw Pact, and the two latest members, Sweden and Finland, had been neutrals during the post-World War II era. Hungary, Slovakia, and Turkey have foreign policies that are more constructive towards Russia, whereas Poland and Estonia are much more anti-Russian. Luxembourg has a military of less than 1,000 serving members. And Iceland does not have a military at all, when compared to the U.S. having nearly 1.4 million in its active duty ranks. The point is that while 32 NATO countries contribute significantly to NATO's military strength, the actual implementation of this power depends entirely on these diverse nations agreeing on Article 5 implementation in a crisis. All countries joining NATO agree to the principles of Article 5 and collective defense. Relying on member countries to uphold Article 5 presents two issues. The first is that NATO countries, as a requirement of membership, have to follow democratic principles, and that includes free elections. This means that leaders that agree to the terms of NATO membership may be replaced by leaders that are less inclined to NATO or not aligned with the direction of NATO military and political leadership in their policy and threat assessments. This could make them less disposed to support NATO leadership or even use their inherent veto to stop any NATO policy changes, and that is the crux of the second issue. NATO rules require unanimous consent on nearly all relevant decisions, including policy and strategy. NATO has adopted a Clausewitzian model wherein military action represents the exercise of politics through alternative methods, but it also maintains a relatively hands-off approach once military action commences. This implies that once military operations are initiated, they are not subject to the unanimous consent of the political leadership. This is in theory, since NATO has not fought a war as an organization. Its operations in Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan were more peacekeeping and stability missions and not combat missions. So it's not sure how the political leadership may attempt to direct NATO war like what Johnson administration did during the Vietnam War. The second issue pertains to the requirement of unanimous consent for all political decisions prior to military action, which includes the invocation of Article 5 and the use of collective defense to defend a member country. Article 5, like all other decisions of NATO, requires debate and unanimous consent to invoke it. The founding members of NATO anticipated this potential issue and exhibited a degree of flexibility in defining a military response to defend an attacked NATO country. Therefore, consenting to Article 5 does not require military force response, but it does allow a member country to provide support to an attacked NATO country. If the individual country chooses not to respond with military force, they have additional options within Article 5 to respond by providing military aid or imposing sanctions against the aggressor. Unanimous consent does not mean unanimous response, and thus the military potential of NATO can be watered down even with a unanimous consent of Article 5. Even with the diluted options and responses to support Article 5, there is no guarantee of unanimous consent. For illustration purposes, let's assume that Russia launches an attack on Romania in the Black Sea. NATO initiated a debate on Article 5 as a response, but Turkey asserted its desire to facilitate negotiations aimed at reducing tensions between Romania and Russia rather than risking a wider war. Consequently, Turkey exercises its veto power and rejects the call for Article 5 in the defense of Romania. At this point, NATO cannot respond as a unified organization, and its military potential is reduced to nearly zero in this example. In this same scenario, Romania has the ability to defend itself, and NATO nations have the ability to support it. However, this assistance does not come from NATO, but rather from the recognition of collective and individual defense in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. This does not mean that the UN is involved, but just that it recognizes that the defense of Romania is as allowed under the interpretation of the rules of war. The NATO countries that are responding to assist Romania would do so on their own and would not be guaranteed the use of NATO facilities or NATO infrastructure since Article 5 was not invoked. This issue may become more complex if the veto of Article 5 affects the operations of countries providing assistance. Again, for instance, if Russia attacks Finland, but Sweden vetoes Article 5, Finland's NATO war plans to use Swedish territory for the defensive depth of its armed forces are nullified. Or, another example, Germany uses its veto power after Poland was attacked by Belarus, and Germany forbids any country trying to move armed forces or equipment to Poland. They are denied the use of the NATO transportation plan that allows NATO forces to pass freely eastward through Germany. Developed on the basis of a 32-nation collective defense bloc, assumptions and plans for NATO defense often rely on any shaky foundations and even diluted measures of potential Article 5 consent. There are twofold examples of political will and policy and unanimous consent that mean that even the theoretical strength of NATO is only that, theoretical. In the worst case examples, if Russia or China are considered military threats to NATO, all NATO and China need to do is compromise at least one country to stop a NATO collective response. It also does not have to be a country to be compromised, but just have a different view on how to manage a crisis. As a result, a veto could nullify any NATO plan that depends on combined strength, resources, or even the right of passage across borders. The result is that NATO expansion has made it unquestionably militarily stronger as an organization, but also has unquestionably made it politically weaker. And politics in a Clausewitzian model is what is needed to make military potential a reality. Even if they go against NATO's will, countries that make decisions in their own interests are still following the NATO Charter. If NATO wants to address issues that could potentially make the alliance impotent, it needs to amend its rules, which in itself will require unanimous consent. If collective defense is considered the best political option, an alternative would be to create a smaller, more politically aligned defense organization that would supplement NATO but remain outside of NATO's control.